The gunshot echoed through the pines, causing Delilah Winters to flinch as she huddled by the fallen log, clutching her wounded leg. Blood seeped through her torn dress, a stark crimson against the faded blue calico that had once been her Sunday best. It was 1876, in the untamed Wyoming territory, and she was miles from anywhere resembling civilization, with nothing but the sound of approaching hoofbeats to either signal her salvation or seal her doom. Delilah had been traveling with the wagon train headed for Oregon when the attack came outlaws who scattered the travelers like leaves in a windstorm. She'd fled on horseback until her mount stepped in a prairie dog hole, throwing her. The fall had snapped her ankle and sent her tumbling down a ravine. For 2 days, she dragged herself through the wilderness, surviving on wild berries and stream water until exhaustion claimed her beside this massive fallen pine. The hoofbeats grew louder. Delilah pressed herself against the rough bark, willing herself invisible, though she knew it was futile. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she caught sight of the rider tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Lucas Reed spotted the woman immediately, though she was trying to hide. Years of tracking had sharpened his eyes to notice what didn't belong, and a woman in a torn blue dress certainly didn't belong against a fallen log in the middle of nowhere. He reined in his dun stallion, squinting against the afternoon sun. "Madam," he called, keeping his distance, "people were skittish out here, and rightly so. Are you hurt?" Delilah considered lying but knew her predicament was obvious. "My leg," she managed, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I've been injured." Lucas dismounted smoothly, tying his horse to a nearby sapling before approaching slowly, hands visible at his sides. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "Name's Lucas Reed. I've got a homestead about 4 miles east of here." "Delilah Winters," she replied, watching him warily. His clothes were dusty but well kept, his face weathered but clean-shaven. Not the look of an outlaw, but appearances could be deceiving in this wild country. Lucas knelt beside her, respectfully keeping some distance. "That's a bad break," he observed, seeing how her ankle twisted unnaturally. "And you're fevered. How long have you been out here?" 2 days, I think, the wagon train." She faltered, remembering the chaos of the attack. The Simmons train, heard about that, outlaws hit them hard. Lucas frowned, calculating. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Winters." "Just Delilah," she said, closing her eyes briefly against a wave of pain. And luck had nothing to do with it, pure stubbornness. A ghost of a smile touched Lucas's lips. "Well, stubbornness won't set that bone or bring down that fever. I can help, if you'll allow it." Delilah hesitated only a moment before nodding. Death waited if she refused, and something in his steady gaze told her she could trust him at least more than she could trust her chances alone in the wilderness. "I'll be back with supplies," he promised, standing. "Can't move you with what I've got now." "It'll take me about 3 hours round trip to my place and back." "I'm not going anywhere," Delilah said with a weak attempt at humor. Lucas smiled fully then, and it transformed his face from handsome to striking. "Sit tight. Try to stay awake if you can." He untied his canteen from his saddle and placed it within her reach, along with a small parcel wrapped in oilskin. Water and some jerky. Small sips, small bites. Before she could thank him, he was back on his horse, spurring it eastward. Delilah watched him disappear into the trees, wondering if he would really return, or if she had just shared her last conversation with another human soul. Lucas pushed his horse harder than he normally would, knowing every minute counted. The woman Delilah was in bad shape, though she hid it well. Infection had likely set in, and the wilderness was unforgiving to the wounded. At his homestead, a modest but solid cabin with a small barn, Lucas worked quickly. He packed bandages, whiskey for disinfecting, willow bark for pain and fever, splints he'd prepared for just such emergencies, food, blankets, and his mother's old dress that he'd kept all these years. He hitched his strongest horses to the wagon, knowing he couldn't transport her on horseback. 3 hours later, just as dusk was falling, Lucas returned to the fallen log, fear gripping him when he didn't immediately spot Delilah. Then he saw her, unconscious now, her skin ashen in the fading light. "Delilah," he called, kneeling beside her and touching her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin alarmed him. Delilah, I'm back. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then clearing as she recognized him. You came back, she whispered, surprise evident in her voice. Said I would, didn't I? Lucas replied, already uncorking the whiskey. This is going to hurt something fierce, but I need to clean that wound before I move you. Delilah nodded, bracing herself. When the whiskey hit her wound, she bit down hard on her lip to keep from screaming, drawing blood. Lucas worked efficiently, cleaning the laceration, setting the broken ankle as best he could, and wrapping it with splints and bandages. You've done this before, Delilah observed through gritted teeth. Army surgeon taught me during the war, Lucas explained, not elaborating. Some memories were best left buried. I'm going to carry you to the wagon now. Before she could protest, he'd scooped her up as gently as possible, cradling her against his chest. Delilah was struck by how solid he felt, how secure, despite the pain that shot through her leg. In the wagon, Lucas had prepared a bed of sorts with blankets and hay to cushion the journey. He laid her down carefully, covering her with another blanket against the evening chill. It's not far, he promised, climbing onto the driver's seat, but it'll be rough going, hold on. The journey seemed endless to Delilah, each jolt of the wagon sending spikes of agony through her leg. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of Lucas's voice speaking softly to the horses, sometimes lost in fever dreams where outlaws chased her through endless forests. When they finally arrived at Lucas's homestead, night had fully fallen. By lantern light, he carried her into the cabin and laid her on his bed, the only one in the one-room structure. Where will you sleep? Delilah asked, her voice faint. Don't you worry about that, Lucas replied, stoking the fire in the stone hearth. First thing is to get that fever down. For 3 days, Lucas barely left Delilah's side except to tend to the animals. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, spooned broth between her parched lips, and changed her bandages with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. When delirium took her, he held her hands to keep her from thrashing and spoke soothingly until she calmed. On the 4th morning, Delilah awoke with her mind clear for the first time since her rescue. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Lucas sat in a chair beside the bed, his head tilted back against the wall, asleep. The stubble on his jaw had grown into the beginnings of a beard, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Delilah studied him openly. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were strong but not calloused like a farmer's, more like those of someone who worked with tools and animals. A small scar cut through his right eyebrow, and his dark hair curled slightly where it touched his collar. As if sensing her gaze, Lucas opened his eyes a startling blue that reminded Delilah of summer skies. You're awake, he said, straightening, and your eyes are clear, fever's broken. Thanks to you, Delilah replied. I don't know how to repay you. Lucas waved away her words. No debt between us, anyone would have done the same. No, Delilah said firmly, not anyone, most would have ridden past or worse. She had seen enough of the world to know kindness was rare, especially to a woman alone. A flush crept up Lucas's neck. You must be hungry. Real food this time, not just broth. He busied himself at the stove, avoiding her gaze as he prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits. The domestic normality of the scene struck Delilah oddly, this stranger cooking for her in his home, while she lay in his bed, wearing what must be his shirt over her undergarments. My dress, she asked suddenly, realizing. Beyond saving, Lucas replied, his back still turned. I've got something else for you when you're ready to get up. My mother's. Been in a chest for years, but it's clean. Delilah fell silent, watching him move about the small cabin. Everything was neat and organized, with a craftsman's tools hung on one wall, books stacked on a small shelf, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. This was the home of a man who lived alone but hadn't surrendered to the slovenliness that often plagued solitary men. When Lucas brought her the plate of food, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected warmth through Delilah's hand. She attributed it to her weakened state and the days of fever. You've been sleeping in that chair for days, she observed. You must be exhausted. Lucas shrugged. Slept in worse places. Tonight you take the bed, I can manage in the chair. With that leg, Lucas shook his head. Not a chance, I'm fine where I am. Delilah wanted to argue but knew he was right. Her ankle, though better, still throbbed constantly and she couldn't put weight on it. Then we're at an impasse, she said, because I won't keep putting you out of your bed. Lucas's lips quirked in that almost smile she was coming to recognize. Stubborn, like you said. Precisely. They fell into an easy routine over the next week. Lucas would rise early to tend to his animals and chores, then return to prepare breakfast. During the day, he would work outside while Delilah, propped up in bed with her leg elevated, read from his small collection of books, or attempted to mend some of his clothes as a small way to repay his kindness. In the evenings, they would share a meal, and Lucas would tell her stories of the territory, the best hunting spots, the changes of the seasons, the neighboring homesteaders miles away. Delilah found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations, drawn to the quiet confidence with which Lucas spoke and the intelligence behind his words. On the 8th day, Lucas fashioned a crude crutch for Delilah, allowing her to move about the cabin. The first time she stood, her head swam from the days of bed rest, and Lucas caught her elbow to steady her. Easy, he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. No rush. Delilah was acutely aware of his proximity, of the clean scent of soap and outdoors that clung to him. I'm fine, she insisted, though she didn't pull away immediately. When she was steady, Lucas stepped back, giving her space. Delilah tested the crutch, finding it surprisingly comfortable despite its rough appearance. You're good with your hands, she observed, then flushed at how the words sounded. Lucas cleared his throat. Used to make furniture before I came west, still do some carpentry when there's call for it. Why did you come west? Delilah asked, realizing she knew very little about the man who had saved her life. Lucas's expression closed slightly. After the war, couldn't settle back into city life. Too many ghosts. He busied himself with stoking the fire. What about you? Why Oregon? Delilah recognized the deflection but respected it. My aunt lives there. She's the only family I have left after my parents died last winter. Influenza. I'm sorry, Lucas said, and the simple sincerity in his voice touched something in Delilah. So am I, she replied softly. But forward is the only direction left. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Delilah using the opportunity to let her ankle breathe without bandages, Lucas surprised her by pulling out a fiddle from a case beneath his bed. You play, she asked, delighted. Not well, he admitted. But out here, any music is better than none. He began to play, and while his assessment of his skill was modest, the sweet, mournful tune filled the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Delilah closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, transporting her away from pain and uncertainty. When she opened her eyes, Lucas was watching her, his expression unguarded for once. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of connection that went beyond rescuer and rescued. Lucas looked away first, returning the fiddle to its case. Getting late, he said gruffly. Best rebandage that ankle before you sleep. As his fingers worked deftly, wrapping the clean bandages around her ankle, Delilah found herself studying the top of his head, the way his hair fell forward as he concentrated. An impulse seized her, and before she could reconsider, she reached out to brush a strand back from his forehead. Lucas went still, his hands pausing on her ankle. Slowly he looked up, his eyes questioning. Thank you, Delilah said simply, letting her hand fall, for everything. Lucas nodded once, finishing his task in silence, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, charged with unspoken possibilities. That night, as Delilah lay in the bed and Lucas settled into his chair, neither spoke of what had passed between them, but both remained awake long into the night, listening to the other breathe. Spring was advancing rapidly, bringing with it longer days and the promise of wildflowers. Delilah's strength returned quickly, and soon she was able to move about the cabin with increasing confidence, though her ankle still pained her if she stood too long. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after Lucas had found her, Delilah was sitting on the small porch he had built, soaking in the sun, when a rider approached. She tensed instinctively, her hand reaching for the rifle Lucas had left propped beside her, another sign of his quiet thoughtfulness. The rider proved to be a weathered man in his 50s who introduced himself as Harold Jenkins, Lucas's nearest neighbor at 5 miles distant. "Just checking in," he explained, eyeing Delilah with undisguised curiosity. Lucas mentioned he had a guest recovering. "Delilah Winters," she replied, keeping her hand near the rifle. "Mr. Reed saved my life." Harold nodded knowingly. "Sounds like him. Boy's got a good heart, even if he keeps to himself most times." He shifted in his saddle. "Post came through the settlement, got a letter for Lucas." "Government seal." He handed Delilah an envelope, which she accepted with a murmur of thanks. Harold tipped his hat, clearly burning with questions he was too polite to ask, and rode off with promises to tell his wife that Lucas's guest was recovering well. When Lucas returned from checking his trap lines, Delilah handed him the letter. "Your neighbor Jenkins brought it." Lucas frowned at the envelope, turning it over in his hands before opening it. As he read, his expression darkened. Bad news. Delilah asked, concerned by the sudden tension in his shoulders. "Land office," Lucas replied, folding the letter precisely. "There's a dispute over my claim. Someone's filed paperwork saying this parcel was promised to them first. Can they do that?" Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "They can try. Means I need to go to Cheyenne, speak to the land agent directly. It's a 3-day ride at least." "When will you go?" Delilah asked, trying to ignore the flutter of unease at the thought of Lucas leaving. "Soon as possible." "Can't risk losing this place." He looked at her, concern evident. "But I can't leave you alone, not until you're fully healed." "I'm much better," Delilah insisted. "I can manage." Lucas shook his head. "Not out here, you can't, not yet." He paced the small cabin, thinking. "Jenkins's wife might take you in while I'm gone." The thought of being handed off to strangers, however well-meaning, sent a pang through Delilah. "I could go with you," she suggested. "I can ride now, I'm sure of it." "A 6-day round trip would be too much for your leg," Lucas countered. "And Cheyenne's no place for a lady on her own." "I wouldn't be on my own," Delilah pointed out. "I'd be with you." Lucas stopped pacing, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "That's not much better in the eyes of society, Delilah, an unmarried woman traveling with a man." "Society isn't here," she replied simply, "and I've already been sleeping under your roof for weeks. If my reputation is to be ruined, the damage is done." A muscle ticked in Lucas's jaw. "That's not how I see it." "I know," Delilah said softly. "That's why I trust you." The next morning, Lucas announced his decision. "We leave tomorrow at first light. Jenkins's wife is sending over a proper dress for traveling. We'll say you're my sister if anyone asks." Delilah bit back a smile at his practical solution. "Your sister with a different surname." "Cousin then," Lucas amended, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Point is, we need a story that won't raise eyebrows." Mrs. Jenkins arrived that afternoon with not only a dress, but also a basket of food for their journey and enough curiosity to fuel a week of conversation. She was a kindly woman with quick eyes that missed nothing, including the way Lucas hovered protectively near Delilah. "It's good of you to help your cousin," Mrs. Jenkins said, emphasizing the word just enough to show she didn't believe it for a second. "Family is everything out here." "Yes, madam," Lucas replied evenly, refusing to be baited. When she had gone, Delilah burst into laughter. She didn't believe a word. "Doesn't matter," Lucas said, though a smile played at his lips. "She'll keep others from asking too many questions." They set out the next morning, Delilah riding Lucas's gentlest mare while he took the dun stallion. Her ankle was strapped tightly, and Lucas had fashioned a special stirrup that allowed her to rest her injured foot without putting weight on it. The journey was slow but not unpleasant. The Wyoming spring painted the landscape in soft greens and early wildflowers, and the air carried the scent of pine and new growth. They made camp early each evening, giving Delilah time to rest her leg. Lucas was unfailingly considerate, setting up her bedroll in the most comfortable spot, always within sight of his own, but with a respectful distance between them. He hunted fresh game for their meals and showed Delilah which plants were safe to eat, knowledge passed down from an old Shoshone man who had befriended him when he first arrived in the territory. On the second night, as they sat by the campfire after a meal of rabbit stew, Delilah found the courage to ask about his past. "You mentioned the war," she began. "Were you a soldier?" Lucas stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. Union Army. Enlisted in '63 when I was 18, saw things no man should see. He poked at the fire with a stick. Was at Appomattox when Lee surrendered. Thought that would be the end of it, but some things stay with you. Is that why you came west? Delilah asked gently. To forget. Lucas gave a humorless laugh. To remember who I was before, maybe. In Philadelphia, I was just another broken soldier. Out here. He gestured to the vast landscape around them. Out here, a man is measured by what he does, not what he's seen. And what you do is save women by fallen logs, Delilah said, trying to lighten his mood. It worked. Lucas smiled, a genuine one that reached his eyes. Only the stubborn ones. They reached Cheyenne late on the third day, a growing town that seemed impossibly busy after the solitude of Lucas's homestead. They took rooms at a modest hotel, Lucas insisting on separate accommodations despite the expense, and agreed to meet for supper in the hotel dining room. Delilah used the opportunity to wash thoroughly and change into Mrs. Jenkins's dress, which fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the bodice. She arranged her hair as best she could without proper pins and dabbed water on her cheeks to bring some color to them. When she entered the dining room, she saw Lucas already seated, but almost didn't recognize him. He had shaved and his hair was neatly combed. He wore a clean shirt and vest that showed the breadth of his shoulders to advantage. He stood when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly. You look. He began, then seemed to think better of whatever he was going to say. How is your ankle? Better every day, Delilah replied, taking the seat he held for her. You clean up well, Mr. Reed. A flush crept up his neck. Figured I should look respectable for the land office tomorrow. They ate a simple but well-prepared meal, both acutely aware of the eyes of other diners occasionally turning their way. In the small dining room, their conversation remained polite and impersonal, but Delilah found herself missing the easy talks by the firelight in Lucas's cabin. The next morning, Lucas went to the land office while Delilah rested in her room, her ankle protesting after the long journey. When he returned mid-afternoon, his expression was grim. That bad? Delilah asked as he closed the door behind him. Worse, Lucas replied, pacing the small room. The claim against mine is from the Harrington Mining Company. They're saying the land has copper deposits and was marked for mineral rights before I filed my homestead claim. Do you have copper on your land? Lucas shook his head. Not that I've ever found. But that won't stop them from tearing up every acre looking for it if they get control. What can you do? Fight it legally, which means staying in town until the hearing next week. He ran a hand through his hair, mussing the neat arrangement from the day before. I can't ask you to stay here that long. Delilah considered her options. Her original plan to reach Oregon seemed distant now, almost like a dream from another life. The thought of leaving Lucas and continuing her journey alone held no appeal. I have nowhere urgent to be, she said carefully. And I still owe you for saving my life. You don't owe me anything, Lucas insisted. Then let me stay because I want to, Delilah said, meeting his gaze steadily. Something shifted in Lucas's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or a decision made. All right, he said softly. But we'll need to be careful about appearances. Small towns have big eyes. I'm not concerned with gossip, Delilah replied. You should be, Lucas countered. Your reputation is already compromised by traveling alone with you, she finished for him. As I said before, that damage is done. I'd rather face a few whispers than leave you to fight this battle alone. Lucas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Thank you, he said simply. The days in Cheyenne passed quickly. Lucas spent most of his time meeting with a lawyer and gathering documents to prove his claim, while Delilah explored the small but growing town. Her ankle continued to improve, though she still walked with a slight limp that Lucas assured her would fade with time. They developed a routine of meeting for meals and evening walks when Lucas wasn't occupied with his case. On these walks, arm in arm to help support Delilah, they would discuss the day's events and plans for the hearing. To any observer, they might have appeared to be a courting couple, and neither corrected this assumption when they encountered acquaintances Lucas had made in town. On the third evening, they passed a small church where music spilled out into the twilight. A sign announced a social to raise funds for a new bell tower. "Shall we?" Lucas asked, surprising Delilah. He had shown little interest in social gatherings. Inside, the church hall was decorated with spring flowers and lit with oil lamps that cast a warm glow over the assembled townsfolk. A small band played lively tunes, and several couples danced in the cleared center of the room. Delilah felt suddenly self-conscious in her borrowed dress, aware that most of the women wore finer garments. Lucas seemed to sense her discomfort. "You outshine them all," he said quietly, leading her to a bench along the wall. "Flatterer," Delilah replied, though the compliment warmed her. They watched the dancing for a while, declining offers to join when it was clear Delilah's ankle would not permit it. Lucas disappeared briefly, returning with cups of punch and small plates of cake. "Not as good as your biscuits," he commented after taking a bite. Delilah laughed. "Now I know you're flattering me. My biscuits are like rocks, delicious rocks," Lucas insisted with a straight face. The band struck up a slower tune and several older couples took to the floor. Lucas watched them for a moment, then turned to Delilah. "May I have this dance?" he asked, standing and offering his hand. "Just swaying in place won't hurt your ankle." Delilah hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd be honored." Lucas led her to a corner of the dance floor where they wouldn't be jostled by other dancers. He placed one hand respectfully at her waist, holding her other hand gently in his. They began to sway slowly to the music, barely moving from their spot. Being this close to Lucas, Delilah could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the small scar on his chin she hadn't noticed before. His hand at her waist was warm through the fabric of her dress, solid and reassuring. "When did you learn to dance?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the flutter in her chest. "My mother insisted," Lucas replied, his voice low. "Said no son of hers would grow up a complete savage even if we did live on the edge of civilization. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was." A shadow passed over Lucas's face. "Died when I was 16. Father followed 2 years later. That's when I enlisted." "I'm sorry," Delilah said, unconsciously tightening her grip on his hand. Lucas's gaze softened. "It was a long time ago." The music ended, but they remained standing close, hands still joined, until a burst of laughter from nearby broke the spell. Lucas stepped back, clearing his throat. "We should probably head back," he suggested. "Big day tomorrow with the preliminary hearing." Outside, the night had grown cooler, and Lucas draped his jacket over Delilah's shoulders without comment. They walked in companionable silence back to the hotel, both lost in their own thoughts. At Delilah's door, Lucas hesitated. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said. "It's been a long time since I enjoyed myself at a social gathering." "Thank you for asking me," Delilah replied. She reached up, acting on impulse, and brushed a quick kiss against his cheek. "Good night, Lucas." Before he could respond, she slipped inside her room, heart racing as if she'd done something far more daring than a simple kiss on the cheek. The preliminary hearing the next day went poorly. The Harrington Mining Company's lawyer presented maps allegedly showing copper deposits throughout the region, including Lucas's land. Despite Lucas's lawyer arguing that no actual survey had been conducted on the specific parcel, the land agent seemed inclined to favor the larger company. "They've got him in their pocket," Lucas fumed as they walked back to the hotel. "Probably promised him shares in the company. There must be something we can do," Delilah insisted, hating to see the defeat in Lucas's eyes. "The full hearing is in 3 days. If we had proof there's no copper on my land or evidence that their maps are falsified." Lucas shook his head. "But it would take weeks to get a proper geological survey, and we don't have that kind of time." An idea struck Delilah. "What about newspaper records? If the company has made similar claims elsewhere, perhaps there's a pattern." Lucas stopped walking, looking at her with newfound hope. "That's brilliant. The newspaper office might have records of other land disputes." They spent the next 2 days poring over back issues of the Cheyenne newspaper and telegraphing other towns where Harrington Mining had operations. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The company would claim mineral rights, force out small landowners, conduct minimal mining operations, and then abandon the sites when no significant deposits were found. "They're land speculators," Lucas realized. "They don't care about copper. They're acquiring prime property to resell once the railroad expansion is announced. Armed with this information and supporting documentation from 3 other communities, Lucas and his lawyer presented their case at the full hearing. The land agent, faced with evidence of the company's dubious practices, ruled in Lucas's favor, confirming his homestead claim and rejecting Harrington's mineral rights application. Outside the land office, Lucas lifted Delilah in a spontaneous embrace, spinning her around despite her injured ankle. "We did it," he exclaimed, setting her down but keeping his hands at her waist. "I couldn't have done this without you." Delilah, breathless from the unexpected display, smiled up at him. "You would have found a way." "No," Lucas said seriously. "I wouldn't have. I was ready to accept defeat. You showed me how to fight smarter." Their eyes met, and for a moment Delilah thought he might kiss her right there on the street in front of the land office. Instead, he stepped back, offering her his arm with newfound formality. "Let's celebrate," he suggested. "Dinner at the hotel, and then we can leave for home in the morning." Home. The word hung between them, its meaning unclear. Was he referring to his homestead as her home now too? Or simply stating his own plans to return? Delilah took his arm, pushing aside these questions for later. Dinner sounds wonderful. That evening they dined in the hotel restaurant, splurging on the finest meal on the menu in celebration. Lucas ordered a bottle of wine, something he admitted he rarely indulged in. "To victory," he toasted, raising his glass. "To partnership," Delilah countered, touching her glass to his. The word hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities. "Delilah," Lucas began, his voice serious, "when we return to the homestead, we need to discuss your plans." Her heart sank. "You want me to leave?" "No," he said quickly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "That's not what I meant. I don't want to assume anything. You were headed to Oregon for a reason. Your aunt is expecting you." Delilah had almost forgotten about her original destination. Her life before Lucas had found her by that fallen log seeming distant and unreal now. "I should write to her," she acknowledged. "Let her know I'm safe, at least." "Of course," Lucas agreed. And then Delilah met his gaze steadily. "That depends on whether there's a reason for me to stay." Lucas's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want there to be," he said quietly, "more than I've wanted anything in a long time." The world around them seemed to fade away, the murmur of other diners, the clink of silverware, all receding until there was only this moment, this connection between them. "Then ask me," Delilah whispered. Lucas swallowed hard. "It's too soon. We've known each other barely a month. And in that month, you've saved my life, nursed me back to health, shared your home, and trusted me to help save your land," Delilah pointed out. "I'd say we know each other better than most couples who court for years." A smile tugged at Lucas's lips. "When you put it that way." "I'm not saying we should rush," Delilah clarified. "Only that I don't need more time to know my own heart." Lucas's eyes darkened. "And what does your heart say, Delilah Winters?" "That I've found something I wasn't even looking for," she replied simply. "Something I don't want to leave behind." They left Cheyenne the next morning, their relationship subtly but fundamentally changed. Where before there had been careful distance, now there were small touches. Lucas's hand at the small of Delilah's back as he helped her onto her horse, their fingers brushing as they passed a canteen, shoulders touching as they rode side by side. The journey home seemed shorter, perhaps because neither was eager for it to end and the decisions that would follow. They camped the first night in a small clearing beside a stream, where Lucas surprised Delilah by producing a small pouch of coffee, a luxury he had purchased in town. "For special occasions," he explained as he brewed it over the fire. "And what's the occasion?" Delilah asked, accepting the tin cup he offered. Lucas met her gaze over the rim of his own cup. "New beginnings, I hope." That night, their bedrolls were placed closer together than on the journey to town, though still with propriety maintained. As Delilah drifted to sleep, she could hear Lucas's steady breathing nearby, a sound that had become synonymous with safety in her mind. They reached the homestead late the following afternoon. The small cabin, nestled among the pines with the barn and corral beside it, looked different to Delilah now, not just a temporary shelter, but a place that felt like it could be home. Lucas helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "Welcome back," he said, his voice holding a question Delilah understood. "It's good to be home," she replied, making her choice clear. The smile that broke across Lucas's face was worth any uncertainty she might have felt. He reached for her hand, leading her toward the cabin, but stopped halfway there. "Wait," he said. "There's something I need to do first." To Delilah's surprise, Lucas knelt on one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. His other hand reached into his pocket, withdrawing a simple silver band. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "I've carried it with me since she died, waiting for, well, for you, though I didn't know it then." Delilah's free hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Delilah Winters," Lucas continued, "I know it's fast, and maybe I'm a fool for asking so soon, but life out here has taught me not to waste time when something matters, and you matter more than anything ever has to me." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me? Not right away if you're not ready, but someday. Will you make this place your home and me the happiest man in Wyoming territory?" Delilah could barely see through her tears, but her voice was steady when she answered. "Yes," Lucas read, "yes to all of it." Lucas slid the ring onto her finger. It was loose, but could be adjusted, and rose to his feet, pulling her into his arms. This time, there was no hesitation as he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "Have since I found you by that fallen log, I think, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself." Delilah laughed softly. "And they say I'm the stubborn one." "We're well matched then," Lucas replied, kissing her again briefly before leading her toward the cabin, their home now, not just his. Inside, everything was as they had left it, though a fine layer of dust had settled in their absence. Lucas built a fire while Delilah swept the floor, the domestic tasks feeling natural, as if they had been doing them together for years rather than days. That evening, they sat side by side on the small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Lucas's arm was around Delilah's shoulders, her head resting against him. "When would you like to be married?" he asked, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. Delilah considered. "Soon, but not too soon. There are things to prepare." "The cabin needs work if it's to be a proper home for a wife," Lucas agreed. "Another room, at least, a bigger garden." "And I should write to my aunt," Delilah added. "Ask her to come for the wedding if she can make the journey." Lucas nodded. Of course, family should be there. The word hung between them, full of meaning. Family, something neither had had for too long, something they would build together. "Do you want children?" Delilah asked, the question slipping out before she could consider its boldness. Lucas's arm tightened around her. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Very much. I've always dreamed of a house full of children," Delilah admitted, "though out here it might be challenging." "We'll manage," Lucas assured her. "This land has plenty to offer a family willing to work hard. And we'll make trips to town for supplies, schooling when they're older." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each imagining the future they would build together. "I never thought I'd find this," Lucas said eventually. "After the war, I figured I'd live out my days alone." "Seemed safer that way." "Safer?" Delilah questioned. Lucas sighed. "Losing people, it breaks something inside you. I lost so many friends in the war than my parents. Decided it was easier not to care too deeply." "And now?" Delilah asked, looking up at him. "Now I'm terrified," Lucas admitted with a small smile, "and happier than I've ever been. Turns out those two things can exist together." Delilah reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm scared too," she confessed, "but not of loving you. Of how much I already do after so little time." Lucas turned his head to kiss her palm. "Time doesn't measure love. Actions do." The weeks that followed were busy with preparations. Lucas began work on expanding the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as their bedroom, leaving the main room as a combined kitchen and living area. Delilah, now fully recovered from her injury, planted an expanded garden with seeds Lucas purchased on a trip to the settlement. They were married on a perfect June day, with wildflowers in full bloom across the meadow beside the cabin. Delilah wore a new dress, ordered from a catalog and delivered just in time. Lucas had a new shirt and had his boots polished to a shine that made Delilah tease him about his vanity. The ceremony was small but meaningful. Delilah's aunt had made the journey from Oregon, bringing with her a quilt as a wedding gift. The Jenkins family attended, along with a few other neighboring homesteaders and the circuit preacher who performed the ceremony. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch Lucas had built and Delilah had decorated with wildflowers, both felt the weight and joy of the promises they made. These were not words spoken lightly, but commitments forged through shared hardship and triumph. "I, Lucas, take you, Delilah, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Lucas's voice rang clear in the mountain air. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Delilah repeated the vows, her voice trembled slightly, not from uncertainty, but from the depth of emotion she felt. "I, Delilah, take you, Lucas, to be my lawfully wedded husband." The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Lucas kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Delilah's eyes. The small gathering cheered, and Mrs. Jenkins wiped away tears of her own. The celebration that followed was simple but joyous. A feast spread on tables outside the cabin, music from Jenkins's son, who played the fiddle better than Lucas ever could, and dancing on the packed earth of the yard. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Lucas found Delilah sitting on the porch steps, watching their guests. "Happy, Mrs. Reed?" he asked, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "More than I can say," Delilah replied, leaning against his shoulder, "though I'm also looking forward to when they all leave." Lucas chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. Scandalous talk from a new bride. "Honest talk," Delilah countered, squeezing his hand. "I've been waiting to be alone with my husband since the moment I said I do." Lucas's eyes darkened, and he lifted her hand to his lips. "Then perhaps we should encourage our guests to depart." Later, as the last wagon disappeared down the trail and twilight settled over the homestead, Lucas swept Delilah into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room, now cleared of the day's festivities. "I've been home since the day you found me," Delilah replied, reaching up to unpin her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. "I just didn't know it yet." Lucas watched, transfixed, as her golden hair cascaded down. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Delilah stepped closer, placing her hands on his chest. "And you're mine," she whispered, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. The summer passed in a haze of happiness as Lucas and Delilah settled into married life. The expanded cabin proved perfect for their needs, and Delilah's garden flourished under her care. Lucas's trapping and hunting, combined with Delilah's skillful preservation of food, ensured they would have plenty for the coming winter. In August, as they sat on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the distant mountains, Delilah turned to Lucas with a smile that held a secret. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Lucas stared at her, speechless for a moment, before a slow, wondering smile spread across his face. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Are you certain?" Delilah nodded. "As certain as I can be. Come spring, there will be 3 of us." Lucas pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. When he pulled back, Delilah was surprised to see tears in his eyes. "You've given me everything," he said hoarsely. "A reason to live, a family, a future. I don't know how I'll ever be worthy of it all." "You already are," Delilah assured him, wiping away a tear that had escaped down his cheek. "You're the man who stopped for a stranger by a fallen log when others would have ridden past. The man who nursed me back to health and asked for nothing in return. The man I love more each day." Lucas kissed her then, pouring all his emotions into the embrace. When they parted, he placed his hand once more on her stomach, a gesture of wonder and protection. "A baby," he said again, shaking his head in amazement. "Our baby." As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Lucas worked tirelessly to prepare for both winter and the coming child. He built a cradle from pine wood, carving delicate leaves and animals along its edges. He added extra insulation to the cabin walls and laid in more firewood than they could possibly use. Delilah, meanwhile, sewed tiny garments and preserved the garden's bounty. Her stomach began to round, and Lucas took to talking to it each night, telling stories of the land and promises of the adventures they would have together. Winter arrived with the first heavy snow in November, blanketing the homestead in pristine white. The cabin was snug and warm, with the fire burning steadily in the hearth and the scent of Delilah's cooking filling the air. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire, Lucas presented Delilah with a small carved box. "I made this for you," he said, watching nervously as she opened it. Inside lay a delicate wooden brooch, carved in the shape of a wildflower with a small pearl at its center. "It's beautiful," Delilah breathed, lifting it carefully. "The flower that was blooming by the log where we met." Lucas nodded, pleased she had recognized it. "I wanted you to have something to remember that day, the day that changed everything." "As if I could ever forget," Delilah said, pinning the brooch to her dress. "It was the day my life truly began." The winter months passed peacefully, with occasional visits from the Jenkins family, their only contact with the outside world. Delilah's pregnancy progressed well, her body growing round with new life. Lucas found himself constantly watching her, marveling at the miracle taking place before his eyes. In late March, as the first signs of spring began to appear, Delilah went into labor. Lucas sent word to Mrs. Jenkins, who arrived quickly to assist with the birth. For 18 hours, Lucas paced the cabin, alternating between helping where he could and being banished to the porch when his anxiety became too much for the women to bear. Finally, as dawn broke on a clear spring morning, the cry of a newborn filled the cabin. Lucas rushed inside to find Delilah, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. "Come meet your daughter," she said, her voice tired but joyful. Lucas approached with reverence, his large hands suddenly seeming enormous as Delilah placed the baby in his arms. The infant had a dusting of dark hair like his and Delilah's delicate features. "She's perfect," he whispered, afraid to speak too loudly. "Just like her mother." "What shall we call her?" Delilah asked, watching the love bloom on her husband's face as he gazed at their child. Lucas considered for a moment. "Hope," he suggested, "because that's what she is, hope for our future, hope for all the good things to come." "Hope Reed," Delilah tried the name. "It's beautiful." Mrs. Jenkins, who had been quietly cleaning up, smiled at the new family. "I'll leave you three to get acquainted," she said, slipping out the door with promises to return the next day to check on them. Alone with his wife and daughter, Lucas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, still cradling the baby. "I never knew I could feel this much," he admitted. "It's like my heart has grown twice its size." Delilah smiled tiredly. "That's what love does. It expands to make room for more." As spring bloomed fully around the homestead, little Hope thrived. She had Lucas's blue eyes and Delilah's quick smile, and both parents were utterly besotted. Lucas would carry her in a sling as he worked around the property, pointing out birds and plants, explaining everything as if she could understand every word. Delilah would sing to her while working in the garden, old songs her own mother had sung. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, a family complete, watching the sunset paint the sky. One evening, as Hope slept peacefully in her cradle, Lucas took Delilah's hand, leading her outside. "Come with me," he said mysteriously. "I want to show you something." He led her through the twilight to the fallen log where they had first met, now over a year ago. The log was still there, though more weathered, with moss growing along its northern side. "Why are we here?" Delilah asked, curious. Lucas pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they both gazed at the log. "I rode past here every day for 3 years before that day," he said, his voice soft in her ear, never noticing anything special about this spot. He turned her in his arms to face him. "Now it's the most important place in the world to me, the place where our story began." Delilah smiled up at him, her heart full. "And what a story it's been." "With many more chapters to come," Lucas promised, lowering his head to kiss her as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. As they walked back to their cabin, hand in hand, Delilah thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. The attack on the wagon train that had seemed like disaster had led her to this place, this man, this life that she wouldn't trade for anything. Inside, they checked on Hope, still sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Lucas placed his arm around Delilah's waist as they watched their daughter. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" Delilah asked, leaning into his solid warmth. "For being there by that fallen log," Lucas replied. "For trusting me, for giving me a family when I thought I'd always be alone." Delilah turned in his embrace, placing her hand on his cheek. "And thank you for stopping, for coming back with supplies, for finding your heart beside me." They stood there in the gentle lamplight, two people who had found each other against all odds, with their sleeping daughter nearby, a family forged from chance and choice and love that had grown stronger with each passing day. Outside, the Wyoming night spread its star-filled canopy over the homestead, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting by the fallen log. And inside, in the warmth of their cabin, Lucas and Delilah Reed held each other close, grateful for the path that had led them home.